We're glad you're here. Mick Cornett with Camp Myers. We're back on The Verdict, where we meet interesting people and talk about topical issues. And today, one that really goes across the state of Oklahoma and something that just about all of us deal with in one way or another.
Yes, Indian law. We have, of course, a strong connection here in Oklahoma with the Native American tribes in Oklahoma from the standpoint of our name of the state, from the population we have, from the history that we have, and of course the tribes have, in many cases, their own law that they promulgate and follow. And we're going to talk today about the interaction between the federal government, state government, and the Indian tribes, and we've got a real expert to talk to us about that.
Where does it stop? Where does it start? We'll get to it. We're discussing Indian law today on The Verdict, and we'll be right back.
In driving rain, blistering heat, and bitter cold, 365 days a year, 24 hours a day, Chesapeake drills non-stop for natural gas on American soil. Chesapeake drills more new gas wells than anyone else, and from those wells collects the most drilling information and acquires more 3D seismic images, leveraging every efficiency to improve the odds of finding more natural gas every day with every well we drill. The better job we do of discovering bigger reserves of clean burning American natural gas, the greater the prosperity of our nearby communities, our state, and our nation. And as long as there are more gas reserves to be found here in the U.S., we will never rest. Chesapeake. Natural gas wins the day.
Welcome back to The Verdict. Mick Cornett with Camp Myers, and Kent's going to introduce today's guest.
Today we're just very pleased to have Kirke Kickingbird as our guest. Kirke is a member of the Kiowa tribe. He did his undergraduate and his law work at the University of Oklahoma. He's practiced Indian law since 1969. And as part of his activities, he's served for a brief period of time as Chief Justice of the Supreme Court of the Cheyenne and Arapaho Tribes Court. He was special counsel on Indian affairs to Governor Keating. He's been a faculty member at the Oklahoma City University School of Law teaching Indian law. And he is an author, having written a number of articles dealing with Indian law. He's recognized in Oklahoma as, if not the preeminent expert, one of them on Indian law. And we're really pleased he'd give us his time today. Kirke, welcome.
I'm glad to be here.
How many Indian tribes are there in Oklahoma?
Well, there are 39 tribes in Oklahoma, but not all are federally recognized. Some work under the umbrella of other tribal governments.
Really? How did that come down? Why are some recognized and some not?
At the time, part of it's just historical circumstance. The other part is that at the time in history when tribes were being moved to Oklahoma, fairly late out of Kansas, the Delaware had taken the protection of the Cherokee. And they have a treaty and agreement with them to be under their umbrella of government. That's been a source of controversy in recent years, and the Delaware at Bartlesville are hoping to achieve some level of independence from the Cherokee.
Kirke, let me ask you a question kind of related to that. It's something I've always wondered about. We've heard in Oklahoma I grew up here for as long as I've been around, about the 5 civilized tribes. Now, those are all home-based, I guess, here in Oklahoma.
Well, the 5 tribes really moved from southeast United States into this area, part of the whole Indian removal policy under Jackson.
Trail of Tears.
That's correct. That's correct. It's exactly right. And so they selected, well, at the time it was all of Oklahoma, and then after the push to consolidate the United States with California and Texas coming in to be a part of the United States, and more westward expansion, it kind of collapsed and compressed the tribes, and they're pushed to Oklahoma.
But those 5 tribes are still, to this day, I guess, home-based here in Oklahoma.
They are. They're very prominent, very active. They have the most sophisticated governments. And in fact, that's how they won that name, 5 Civilized Tribes, because they, to many non-Indians, appeared to be just on the same par as Indian governments.
Well, how's the taxation work? Does a tribe have to pay taxes to the United States government? Does it work in vice?
Or the state government.
Yeah.
Well, one of the things that developed out of the treaty relationship is that there were governments on both sides, tribal governments and the United States government. Governments don't pay taxes. So in terms of modern federal income tax law, tribes are not contemplated as parties who the federal government can tax.
Because they're a sovereign.
That's correct. And then that same relationship, often in these state constitutions, there are provisions for disclaimers of jurisdiction over the tribes for that very reason. And that's what we have today. With more, in about the 80s, as tax bases grew more difficult to maintain and keep and new demands for services came into being, there have been more competition, more conflict between the tribes and states over taxation.
Well, is there a limit, though, to tribal functions? Can they be in the retail business? Can they open a car lot? I mean, can they do just about anything they would like and get around the taxation?
Well, the essential governmental function is the phrase for most of the governmental services. Mm-hmm. But in addition, the federal government has always, certainly for the last 70, 80 years, promoted tribes to doing business. They've set up special shells, Section 17 corporations under federal charters, in which the tribes are to do business to build their economic base. Part of this is a long-standing development out of the treaty relationships.
Let's focus on an individual tribal member.
Right.
Just a hypothetical tribal member. That tribal member can get, at least in Oklahoma in some circumstances, I guess, a license plate for his or her car from the tribe and not have to have a state license.
That's correct. But you have to have certain conditions in place. One, tribes as sovereigns can issue license tags. 2, the person purchasing the tag needs to live in Indian country, his tribe's Indian country, or on his own allotment. Those circumstances have to be in place. A lot of times that's misunderstood, and we've seen people buy them here in Oklahoma City or Tulsa when they ought to be buying state tags.
Well, are there other things that the individual tribal member can purchase from the tribe or get licensed by the tribe that will take away the requirement of state licensure?
Well, this whole jurisdictional framework depends on that important thing of Indian country. We've got to be an Indian country of his own tribe. The business there will not be subject to state jurisdiction for that reason, unless it's a state corporation. But the tribe itself can tax. So there may be imposition of tribal taxes on activities taking place in Indian country, certain businesses that may be taking place there.
Are there any instances of double taxation where a tribal member gets doubly taxed because the tribe taxes him or her and the state does as well?
That is a classic problem for both Indians and non-Indians, because if they may have incorporated under state law or have their primary domicile under state jurisdiction. As a consequence, they can end up paying federal taxes, state taxes, and tribal taxes. So you get triple taxation.
My goodness. Well, Indian gaming, has that in general been a positive thing for tribes to get involved with? It certainly seems like there's an economic boom. Is there any downside?
Absolutely. It's been a real boon economically. It came into being because tribes had started into the high-stakes bingo area. Congress confirmed it. President Reagan signed the bill. In a way, it was really a method to fulfill the treaty obligations. The U.S. had never appropriated enough money to fulfill many of the services, the health, education, or medical services promised under the treaties. And so this is a way of letting tribes do that essential governmental services rubric. And so it's been very beneficial in terms of governmental services. It means ancillary activities. It means jobs. And in some instances, it's the only economic activity going on in rural Oklahoma, so it's benefiting both Indians and non-Indians.
I wasn't aware of these treaties and where the United States government made promises in areas like health care to the treaties. Are there areas where the United States government has taken steps to provide higher levels of health care to tribes than it has its own citizens?
No, funding-wise, that certainly hasn't occurred. And the other part is, in terms of the dollar amounts and the level of personnel for services, most Indians would start here, while the rest of the population would start here. So even if you got double funding for some instances or more funding, you still wouldn't be on an even playing field.
So is it lower income? It's based on income?
Well, just by virtue of the economics of Indian country, practically it is lower income. But it was just based on part of purchasing the land and providing these services, recognizing that tribes were coming into a new lifestyle. And that promise and the performance related to it in providing those services has never been up to par, never met the goals in the treaties.
All right. We're going to take a break, jump in here. We're discussing Indian law with Mr. Kickingbird. We'll be Kickingbird. Kirke Kickingbird. We'll be right back. You're watching The Verdict.
Shining is taking responsibility. At Blue Cross and Blue Shield of Oklahoma, we know managing your health care can be overwhelming, and it's our job to help you meet the challenge. By guiding, supporting, and showing the way, we encourage you to gain control. Because we believe the best tool we can give you is the confidence to take charge. Blue Cross Blue Shield of Oklahoma, shining through.
Okiwani is an Indian name for a place where children play. When we obtained the camp, we found a lot of oil debris left in the woods. We saw a commercial about how the oil and natural gas industry cleans up old oil well sites. We called the OERB and they agreed to remove tons of concrete and steel. It didn't cost us a thing. Thousands of children have left their footprints on this land. Thanks to the oil and gas industry, they will for a long time to come.
All children deserve a life of hope and love, but sometimes they experience a life of pain, neglect, and abuse.
When that happens, each child deserves all the quality assistance and representation that can be offered in our legal system. For more information, call 23-CHILD.
Oklahoma Lawyers for Children, helping to bring hope and love back to the lives of abused children.
Welcome back to The Verdict. Mick Cornett, Kent Myers, and Kirke Kickingbird, who's discussing Indian law. Kent?
Kirk, I noticed a while back there was an article about the number of casinos in Oklahoma, and I'm remembering the number 89. I may be wrong about that, but it's close to that, of which 88 were Indian casinos, and one was a non-Indian casino at Remington Park. Do you think the number of Indian casinos has been just about built to capacity, or should we anticipate even further expansion?
I think in terms of the numbers, we're probably at the saturation level, just because the locations are pretty well set. But I think what we're going to see is dramatic expansion in the types of facilities and the quality of facilities. We have, most prominently, the Cherokee's Catoosa facility. We have the Chickasaws developing and doubling the size of their facility at Thackerville. And the Comanches have just started work on plans for a new project to build a hotel, casino, increasing their capacity and finding a golf course and a whole variety of related recreational activities.
We've not talked about Oklahoma City and Oklahoma County being in the unassigned lands. How does all that play out? If people are wondering why are there casinos seemingly everywhere, but they're in Oklahoma County where you have the population density, we don't see an Indian casino. There is a Racino at Remington Park,
right,
but no Indian casino. Can you explain that to people who may not understand it?
Well, once again, it's the jurisdictional factor that comes into play. And since there were no reservations inside Oklahoma County, tribes can't build there. We do have the Kickapoos here, and on the eastern side of the county, and they do have a small facility. But since tribes can only build those casinos inside Indian country, and there is nothing in Oklahoma, the unassigned lands, no tribes here. Tribes are all around us, down at Norman with the Riverwind, the Chickasaws, Lucky Star at Concho, and the Potawatomi's Fire Lake Grand Casino there. And we just heard some news up in Stroud that there's certainly going to be economic development that might include a casino up with the Sac and Fox.
Are there other counties that are unassigned lands, or is it just Oklahoma County?
It's just Oklahoma County. Essentially everything but the Panhandle is where casinos are allowed, tribes held some kind of property on it.
All right, let's talk about Indian law and its relationship to Oklahoma law and U.S. law. I'm going to assume if you're driving a car on Indian land, you have to adhere to traffic laws and would be subject to traffic violations of Oklahoma state law. Am I generally right, or is there jurisdictional problems?
The right of way is probably going to be handled by the Highway Patrol, although the tribal police may also be involved. If we have cross-deputization agreements to expand manpower resources, the tribal police could arrest you as well. Or if there was some kind of a bank robbery and hot pursuit and they left, say, Lawton and ran north into the Comanche country, tribal police could arrest them. If there was a cross-deputization agreement, the county police could also probably assist in that apprehension.
What's the most common misperception that viewers might have about the relationship between tribal law and U.S. law and state law?
In fact, I would say the lack of understanding, despite all the publicity, all the recent activities of the last 30, 40 years in cases and their decisions, the fact that tribes are governments that have a separate jurisdiction. It continues to puzzle people, and it's so fundamental.
Some of us are occasionally involved in doing some pro bono work for abused and deprived children, and one thing I've come in contact with only on the edges, but I'd like for you to talk a little bit about, is the Indian Child Welfare Act, a federal law that does apply, of course, to children in Oklahoma as well as other places. Can you tell us generally what that is and how it works?
Well, this started back in the 70s, late 70s. There was a lot of adoption out, and particularly in states across the northern tier border in Canada. The state facilities and welfare workers and the courts would not place the children with Indian families, and because they couldn't qualify because of their economics, the poverty level.
Are we talking just about Indian child?
That's correct.
Indian child?
That's correct.
Okay.
And as a consequence, Congress passed this act to allow tribes to have complete jurisdiction, whether the case was occurring inside Indian country or outside Indian country, in terms of placement, so that they could maintain Indian families intact, place them with relatives, principally, or grandparents, and maintain that continuity with culture, as well as recognize tribal jurisdiction. If the child is eligible, doesn't have to be currently enrolled, is eligible for membership in a tribe, then that tribal court can have jurisdiction if the tribe has set up all the procedures and a special court to deal with domestic matters, particularly child welfare and child placement.
If you're taking the bar in the state of Oklahoma, are there a series of questions about Indian law, or is it handled separately?
There are no questions at all. The only time I've seen a question on the bar was almost probably 15 or 18 years ago when I was teaching. It almost doubled the enrollment of my class because of the recognition that it's an especially complex arena.
Mm-hmm. Well, in that regard, to what extent are law schools today in Oklahoma, the three major law schools in Oklahoma, presenting courses on Indian law, and is it covering what ought to be covered, or does it need to be augmented?
Well, it's commonplace now. You've usually got a basic survey course on Indian law, some kind of seminar, and possibly a clinical program. Tulsa has all three. OU has something similar, and so does OCU. It provides you the opportunity to learn about what could be a vital area of Indian law in Oklahoma, and it's like we were talking earlier before the show started about Joe Rarick and Indian land titles, and his advice was don't practice property law in Oklahoma unless you've taken Indian land titles or load up on your insurance. It's kind of like that with Indian law. It's a complex area.
Are those required courses or elective?
No, unfortunately, those are electives.
Yeah. Do you think at least the basic course ought to be a required course?
I think anybody who's going to stay and practice in Oklahoma needs to have that basic course so he can know two things: either how to begin to handle it, or get it out of his office to someone who can.
Or to recognize it when it comes up.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
In United States law, laws change, they evolve. The legislatures change them, Supreme Courts rule on them and perhaps provide interpretation.
Right.
How is Indian law affected by that, or does Indian law have its own legislative changes and its own Supreme Court that provides interpretation?
Well, there are two aspects to that. One, federal Indian law, as a general proposition, is a law of the United States about Indians. It encompasses the treaties, agreements, statutes to carry out the treaties, and then the court interpretations of both the treaties and statutes. When I started in 1969, there was only one volume, 25 U.S.C. Now there are 4 volumes in that series. So there's a lot of legislation that's taken place. At the same time, starting in the 70s, there's been a lot of growth and explosion in governmental activity, partly by necessity, partly by demand of tribal members, and that has resulted in the adoption of civil and criminal laws, expansion of courts and court procedures, and so it encompasses both of those. And then you've got to figure out the interaction between state law and tribal law, or state law and federal law. So it's a very busy area.
We need to jump in here. We can't believe the show has been wrapped up so quickly. You're obviously an expert, Kirk, and I know you provided a lot of information to our viewers that we appreciate.
Okay.
We need to get you to come
Enjoyed
back.
being here. Thank you.
Kent and I'll have a final word after this.
The good life comes naturally to Tulsa, where nature's beauty is matched with an eye for aesthetics. A legacy of neighborhoods graced with lawns and landscaping and handsome homes. A place that seems to have patented an ideal lifestyle. Bank First is loyal to the quality of life Tulsa assures its citizens, to the priority placed on education, culture, and growth. Loyal to builders who transform raw land into residential charm. Developers who see opportunity and add vitality to Tulsa's economy. Bank First serves both enterprise and private lives that need a loyal partner. It's how we help nurture this city's very good life. Bank First. Loyal to Oklahoma. Loyal to you.
The Journal-Record is pleased to be a sponsor of The Verdict. The Journal-Record, since 1903, the best source of Oklahoma business news and legal information.
Welcome back to The Verdict. Mick Cornett with Kent Myers. We just finished visiting with Kirke Kickingbird, who is an expert on Indian law and provided some valuable insight.
Yes, he's really an experienced practitioner. He's been a jurist under Indian law. He's taught Indian law. He's written about it. There's hardly anybody in Oklahoma that knows as much about it. And knowing about Indian law is only half the knowledge that one needs, and he has both halves. The other half is to know what the U.S. and state law is, and to see how they interact and where they conflict, and if they don't, how do they mesh together. And he just does a grand job. I know if I have a problem in that area, I had one course in Indian law. I won't tell you how many years ago it was. That was my own trail of tears. But I would call Kirk and try to get some help from him. He is just a grand guest, a grand guy, and he knows all there is to know about that subject.
Interesting how 21st century law and activity is directly related to what happened in the 19th century,
yes,
especially in this area.
Well, I thought it was interesting that he was indicating that the Congress sometimes will now enact legislation trying to go back and repair unfulfilled promises of back in the 1800s.
And I'm sure there are many of those.
I'm sure there's still a lot of them, yes.
Well, I'm glad you're with us today on The Verdict. We'll be back next week with another show. In the meantime, I'd love you to go to our website and check it out and send us an idea about a show you'd like to see on an upcoming edition of The Verdict. For Kent Myers, I'm Mick Cornett, and we'll see you next week.
The preceding program was produced exclusively for the Cox Channel.